Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another wonderful evening with the Virtual Tasting Society. I'm Jane Kilkenny, sitting in for Vadim Perlasky. We're excited this evening to welcome Cameron George and Ardbeg. Cameron, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. And as I was flipping through the faces who are starting to populate, I see a bunch of people that I know and love very, very much. So this doesn't feel very much like work here on a Thursday night. This feels like having a couple of drams with people that I enjoy having drams with and get to do it regularly with. So very much so. Thank you for having me. We've got just such a really incredible lineup for this evening. Unfortunately, I was plagued by some technical difficulties. Otherwise, there were a couple of really exciting videos that I was really looking forward to showing and sharing this evening. But I'll have Vadim circulate those at his will as soon as we're down to publish and publicate this tasting. That doesn't stop us from having any fun. The whiskey is what's really important, the community, the camaraderie. So please feel free, ask any questions. I can't actually see the screen here. I've got my camera face towards me. So if somebody wants to take hold and take charge of reading out some of the questions as they come, or just feel free to unmute yourselves. This should be very conversational. This is a brand that we all know and love and have loved for quite some time. So please feel free to chime in with any conversational points that you have about any of the whiskeys or the place. So I guess let's pour ourselves a little bit of Ardbeg 10. I'll introduce myself a little bit. I'll give you a little bit more of the history on the brand, and we'll tie that seamlessly into why I think that Ardbeg 10-year-old is without any hyperbole, mankind's greatest achievement, 100%. Forget going to the moon. That's just, the stars are for lovers. Whiskey, like Ardbeg, is for whiskey lovers. So my name is Cameron George. I have the distinct privilege, pleasure, and honor of being the national ambassador and head of education here in the U.S. on behalf of Ardbeg, a role that I've had for about 5 or 6 years now. I started this role as a massive Ardbeg fan and an Ardbegian myself, much like many of you. Um, I'll tell you about my first trip to Isla and my first trip to Ardbeg Distillery. There's a couple of you who I know who have heard this story first and foremost, so I'd like to apologize to them for retelling, but I think it sets the stage kind of nicely for the evening. So being an Ardbeg fan since I was quite a young bartender, I've always been captured and mesmerized by spirits that have complexity, that have feel, and that have a tethering and an anchoring to a sense of place and provenance from where they come from. Whiskeys and mezcals and rums generally communicate that element of um, sense of place, like the provenance, the plots of land where the raw ingredients are hewn from, the relationship that the people who have worked at those distilleries and in those lands for thousands of years have with the terra firma, with the terra plata beneath their feet, with the earth beneath their feet. That relationship mesmerizes me. So, as a young bartender, I became very enthralled with heavily peated single malt Scotch whiskey, especially ones from Isla. And I happened to be a guest of another distillery on Isla, one that may rhyme with Chocolati. Um, I was visiting that distillery as I'd won a cocktail competition, and I made sure that I wanted to see a couple of the other distilleries. The one that I really wanted to see was Ardbeg. I happened to be working in a very famous whiskey bar here in Seattle at the time, and so I, had a lot of experience with the whiskeys at Ardbeg. So I stepped onto the distillery grounds, and Jackie Thompson, not distillery manager, but mother of the distillery, she basically makes sure that everything is running like clockwork. If you're a big Ardbeg fan, you probably know Jackie. And if you've been to Ardbeg Distillery and you've had the privilege of meeting Jackie, you know that she is one of the most dynamic human beings on the planet. So Jackie and I are walking around the distillery. We get to the Robert Bobby Mill, which is this mill that was actually installed even pre 1815, which is the establishment date of the distillery. This mill is actually a little older than the distillery itself. It was a repurposed mill coming from a Highland distillery. It's known as what's called a hammer mill. So, well, there are a couple of different types of mills. There's a hammer mill, which is not the style that we use. We use a bobby mill, which is a mill that uses three sets of rollers. There's actually only about 15 of them left in Scotland right now, out of about 149 or so single malt Scotch whiskey distilleries. So they're not very common. So we get to the mill, and this is where they grind the barley down into grist, grit, and husk. And there's essentially, as it's coming off, there are these shaky boxes that you can shake, and you can see the granularity of how finely you've ground that barley down. So Jackie is standing in front of the mill, talking to us and telling us about this, the history of this bobby mill. And down in front of the bobby mill, there's a bucket. So I reach into the bucket and I pop some of the barley into my mouth and I chew on it. And I'm like, this is Ardbeg 10-year-old. This is where it all starts. This is incredible. And just then I see Jackie reach into one of the boxes, put some barley into her mouth, pick up the little bucket and spit it directly into the bucket. So I had eaten barley out of the spit bucket at Ardbeg on my very first visit. So I came with a love of the distillery, but I left with a piece of it in me that day as well. Um, the reason that I tell that story first and foremost right off of the bat is because I think that there's something magical about Ardbeg 10-year-old, about the way that it can transport us from wherever we are, most of us being on the West Coast here this evening, for myself here at my home in Seattle, Washington. This whiskey is able to transport me and teleport me from my living room directly into the still house and into the aging warehouses and back to being in front of that, that bobby mill as this wide-eyed whiskey wondered, searching kid. This whiskey for me is very much so one that I've come to not only love, but that has come to introduce me to people that I love around the world. So I wanted to start this tasting off with this whiskey in particular. Any questions about the distillery itself before we start talking about the components in Ardbeg 10-year-old?
Actually, could you give us the order so that we have it on the recording for anybody that happens to watch this late?
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. So if you're going to watch this a little bit later, shame on you. Just kidding. Watch at your own speed here. We're going to start the tasting off with Ardbeg 10-year-old. That is, in my mind, the flagship of the distillery. It's kind of who we are at our truest. It's the thumbprint of the distillery, right? That's kind of how I describe it. Then we're actually going to be moving into Ardbeg Heavy Vapors. I think that there's something really beautiful. The polarity of those two whiskeys side by side is amazing. So I hope you enjoy that. We'll then move into a whiskey called Ardbeg Wee Beastie, our youngest age statemented whiskey. Then into a side by side or comparative tasting of both of the last two batches of the 19 or Trelan, batch 4 and then batch 5. And then we'll finish and land the plane on Ardbeg's Anamorphic, which is one of the releases from 2023 as well.
Awesome, thanks.
Perfect, not a problem. Yeah. Speaking of landing the plane, for anybody who hasn't been to the distillery or hasn't been to Islay, it's only right that I do, that I attempt to paint with words the picture that the videos that I was going to show this evening would do. So Islay's really not that large of a geographical square region, and Scotland actually isn't that large of a geographical square region. In total, you could actually take the entire country of Scotland, and if you really tried, you could fit it into a landmass about the size of Colorado. So it's really not that large of a region. But getting from north to south, let alone north to southwest, very similarly how Glenmorangie, our sister distillery, is one of the most further north distilleries, and then Islay being on the southwest side of the country as well. It's quite difficult to get from even, say, Edinburgh all the way out to Islay, especially around this time of year. Actually, now thinking about it, they actually have discontinued that flight in total. There's no Edinburgh flight anymore from Edinburgh over to Islay. The only ways on and off of the island are actually going to be those an earlier morning flight that you can take that will take you from Glasgow And that plane is terrifying. We do not fly very often. Actually, I'll be over in a couple of weeks, and rumor has it that we will be flying this trip. But if I can paint a picture here, it's a small, tiny little twin prop plane, about 24 seats, I believe, on the plane. Your backpack is going to be too large to go in the overhead compartment, so it's probably going to have to be checked. You'll taxi down the runway, leaping up into the air, about 5 minutes of sheer terror and turbulence. The plane will shake almost violently. You'll come up through the clouds. It's about 25 to 30 minutes of pure bliss. And then the real terror actually starts as you start to descend down onto the island. You'll actually come over the southern point of the island, making the approach. The plane actually doesn't have a laser targeted like guidance system. So it's landed completely by touch and feel and by sight of the pilots. Now on Isla, which is significantly warmer year round than most of mainland Scotland, there's an interesting naturally occurring problem that starts to present itself. The ambient temperature on Isla being a little bit warmer than the cold air front that's going to be coming from the mainland, that's going to be acting as the tailwind for the flight. So you've got a warm air front and a cold air front hitting each other. And anybody who has flown, or anybody who maybe is an aeronautical enthusiast as well, will be able to tell you that immediately creates what on Isla in Scotland we call a har, or a very thick mist or a fog. It's very difficult to land the plane. In fact, 3 of the flights that I've taken over have all had to go back to Glasgow and land back on the runway there before trying it all the way over again, right? Hence why we don't take the plane very often. The much safer and cozier and comfier route is actually just to take the ferry. You can drive onto the ferry, eat some fish and chips, have a couple of pints. It's a very relaxing trip. Ultimately, one way or another, you'll make it safely and unscathed onto the shores of what I think is one of the most beautiful places on the planet, home of 9 at this current point distilleries. Anybody care to try to name all 9 of the distilleries? I'll love you very dearly and forever. And Vadim may have something very special for you. If you can do it without Googling, who knows? But the penultimate of these distilleries was actually founded in 1815. There was a rash of actually openings around that time period as well, because some of the laws and regulations around single malt Scotch whiskey production and whiskey production in Scotland actually, in generally, just started to lax right around then. You would have seen a series of distilleries start to open, and a lot of the very famed distilleries on Isla, their establishment dates range from about 1815 to about 1825, so on in there. Illegally, though, and illicitly under cover of darkness at a place that was called Ardbeg, or Home of the Beast, which is the name of the farm that Ardbeg is built on. Or the plot of land that the Ardbeg farm is built on is called Ardbeg, or Home of the Beast. Illegally and under cover of darkness, even back into about the 1790s, there's stories of illegal or illicit distillation that were happening and was happening at the site that is now known as Ardbeg Distillery. There was also some illegal distillation happening right up around Lagavulin Farm and over near where they have also founded and created the Laphroaig Distillery. So the southern side of the island, because of the rock formations off of the southern coast, are actually some of the more fertile for stories of illegal distillation as well, which I find very fascinating, right? Any questions before I jump into Ardbeg 10? Sorry,
I was just going to tell you that Bino just popped up in the chat with Ardnamurchan, Ardbeg, Bowmore, Bricklady, Bunahabin, Kilila, Kilholman, Lagavulin, and Laphroaig.
It's not
I love it. I love it.
Ardnahoe. I typed
Ardnahoe.
not
I never get that one right.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. And of course Benno would get that. Like as soon as I logged on and I see that's the very first face that I see over here. All right, fine. You've twisted my arm. I'll have something in the bag for you the next time that I see you here. Of course. It's good to see you, my friend. That's hilarious. Yes, of course. And absolutely nailed them. We're in a interesting time for Scotch whiskey right now. I've been reading a lot of really interesting articles about the state of the economy globally, about the consumer mindset here in the US, and then the ever-changing landscape of how we're consuming whiskey as well. While single malt sales and whiskey sales in Scotland have been not no so bueno, as our friends south of the border here would say, um, things aren't as dismal as they seem. Most of the distilleries are actually distilling and are laying down stock at a fever pitch. So everybody's big bet is on whiskeys, in particular, single malt in Scotland, rebounding as well. And in fact, the blended Scotch whiskey stocks have skyrocketed at an even crazier and even more fever pitch rate than single malt stocks, which I find incredibly interesting as well. So I'm very fond of the idea that pretty soon there will be more than 9 distilleries open and operational on Isla. And there are plans for some other new investment opportunities in relation to whiskey, maybe a second malting facility. Right now, most of the distilleries on Isla take their malted barley from Port Ellen Maltings, which is owned by Diageo. So that creates kind of a little bit of a gatekeeping situation, right? Where there aren't a whole lot of floor malting facilities in Scotland anymore, right? We think about famous ones like Springbank, incredible, iconic floor maltings, but their production tops out about 1.8 to 2.2 million liters of spirit, right? You think about like Lafroig reopening their floor maltings, really incredible work that they've done, but it only suffices for 5% of their malted barley, of their distilleries' appetite for barley, right? You look at Kilhoman, which opened with their floor maltings, even they take Port Ellen and some mainland barley as well. Bruichladdich is the only distillery on Islay that doesn't take barley from Port Ellen malting facility. Their barley is all malted in mainland Scotland and then tankered over to Islay, right? So maybe a second malting facility opening up, maybe some communal aging facilities as well. These are opportunities that excite me as a whiskey fan, and especially an enthusiast of the Islay whiskey scene and community as well there, right? Now, all right. I told you I was going to do it. Let's jump into some Ardbeg 10-year-old here. This is my favorite whiskey from the distillery. Oftentimes, when people look at this whiskey, their first comment is, why is it so incredibly light? 2 reasons. First and foremost, no E150A. Legally in single malt Scotch whiskey, the only additive that you're allowed to add is E150A. It's a caramel coloring agent. If you were to nose your glass of whiskey and it comes up smelling like maybe a little too on the nose of over roasted marshmallow or like slightly burnt marshmallow, that's a pretty good indicator and guess that there have been copious amounts of E150A. I don't think that it necessarily changes the flavor profile. It will change in my effect if used in high enough dosages. It will change the nose and the aromatic profile, but then also it will change the method of engagement, right? When we think about human beings, the first sense that we have realistically that we use when we're tasting and nosing and smelling whiskey isn't even our olfactory epithelium or our taste buds. It's actually our eyes, right? So if you change the optic appearance, you're going to change the experience, right? So at Ardbeg, we don't add any E150A. That's just not our style. And then the second reason that our whiskey is so light is because, well, we're bad listeners. The whiskey just our whiskey is just a bad listener. We can't really push it in one direction or another in ex-bourbon barrels. In terms of the coloration, Ardbeg just doesn't take massive coloration from even first fill ex-bourbon. We really have to bludgeon it over the head with something like Oloroso sherry cask, Pedro Jimenez sherry cask, virgin American oak, virgin French oak does the trick as well. But American oak, especially after a primary use for something like Jack Daniel's Woodford Reserve, one of the Brown Forman projects, usually, since we have a great relationship with them and have for a while. There aren't enough color contributing congeners left in the hemicellulose and the structure of that oak to really force our whiskey to take a deep ambered or coppertine coloration. Our whiskey just does not behave that way. You'll see through the first 3 to 4 years, Ardbeg will usually pick up a lot of notes of like coal and creosote through its in its maturation arc, and then like oak lactone and vanillin and all of those cask contributed characteristics start to roll in at about 4, 5, 6. The whiskey starts to go dormant again. It was a really interesting conversation talking to Bill about maturation not necessarily being like an arc even, but almost like kind of steps in Willy Wonka's house where they make sense and then sometimes they make no sense at all. Maturation doesn't just happen linearly. It happens in more of a chaotic progression. Is one of the things that Bill has helped me understand, and I think that you actually see that in a lot of Ardbeg, because we actually have to take an approach of like almost blenders. When we think about putting together a batch of Ardbeg 10-year-old, there are a couple of different components: some first fill ex bourbon, some second fill ex bourbon, some third fill ex bourbon, and maybe a cheeky little bit of fourth filler in there as well. And we're using them for all of the different we're using them as ingredients essentially, even though that by definition this is still single malt Scotch whiskey because it comes from one distillery, made of malted barley, has no additives other than it has no sort of additive, not even E15 away, and is distilled in pot stills and is aged in oak vessels that are no larger than 700 liters of internal size, right? And occupancy. So even though that we're approaching it almost as blenders, it's still a very much so a single malt Scotch whiskey, and the harmony is bred out of the chaotic nature of maturation, is what I will say. So cheers, Slanjava, to our first whiskey. Hope you enjoy Ardbeg 10-year-old if you haven't already. On the nose, very sweet is one of the first things. Sweet and sweet in perfect harmony. Little bit of savory, little bit of medicinal. To me, it almost strikes as like salt and salinity is how the medicinal aspect manifests for me. A little bit of that savory, almost like bone marrow, like meat butter. Really beautiful, very delicious. Herbal, very herbal, very herbaceous. Our good friends back in the UK would always say, pronounce the H, Cameron. It's herbal, not herbal. Herbal, it's herbal. Any thoughts on Ardbeg 10-year-old?
I was going to say, there's a reason we have our independence.
Mm-hmm. That's hilarious.
Drop our H's.
Yeah, we are our H's. We dropped the H's.
Among other things.
One of the other funny things, years ago, we had a distiller named Brendan McCarran, who used to work for Glenmorangie Company. He was at the time Dr. Bill's right hand, head of maturing whiskey stocks. He since went on to go work at Distell Ventures. He also was site manager for Tobermory, Lecheg, and Bunnahabhain distilleries as well. We love Brendan. And Brendan is just a massive fan of all things from here in the US. I mean, big basketball fan, huge fan of Rick and Morty as well, the comic and the cartoon. And he told me once, he was like, I'm always obsessed with just going to brunch and listening to Americans order brunch. Because he says, instead of saying like how they say back in the UK, all have, it's all do, all do, all do. So I had to spend all day listening to him make fun of Americans say all do when we were at brunch.
That's pretty funny.
Any other thoughts on I love that. Right. Any thoughts on the whiskey itself? Who thought it was more savory than medicinal, or more
I,
herbal than cold driven? What do
yeah,
we think?
granted, my taste buds are a little wonky because I've had a cold, but I've gotten much
Hmm.
more salinity and savory off of it than I would expect from the previous times
Mm,
I've tried this. So okay, I
yeah.
guess there's a bonus for having a cold. But yeah,
Yeah.
this is delicious stuff.
People oftentimes are fearful and afraid of heavily peated whiskeys, right? And I think it's just for a little bit of a lack of understanding and familiarity, right? I mean, like even here in the U.S., our reluctance to something like mezcal, it took a long time for us to get over that hump, and you were starting to see that spirit core category come around a little bit more now as well. I think that we as human beings, we have a predisposition to all things smoky. Like if you tell me that you don't like barbecue, then there's something massively wrong with you, and I can't trust you. I just can't do it. And around the world, there are different styles of cooking and incorporation of smoked botanicals, herbs, roots into our day-to-day lives in almost every single culture. So I think as whiskey fans, and especially people in a room like this where we are entrenched in whiskey already, and all of us as such are ambassadors to the category. We need to remain ever vigilant and patient as we're introducing people to some of these whiskeys and to some of these spirits as well. One of the things that I really love about Ardbeg 10-year-old, especially starting with this in the tasting, is that it is so floral and so citrus driven and saline driven that it's almost inviting up front. It's not like one of the more challenging whiskeys, like a Corey Vrecken, may be a little challenging for somebody who's never had one of our whiskeys before. But our big 10-year-old, in my opinion, is one that I introduce a lot of people to our whiskeys through because of the duality of peat, sweet, and then also the soft characteristic, the spice as well. There's just so many beautiful components in this whiskey that I absolutely love. I think that this is just an absolute masterpiece of a dram.
It's interesting because I would say,
Mm.
funny enough, I find this one, I would call it more muscular than say
Mm.
Corey or like some of the other ones, because it seems to be me a little more less sweet. This is more savory, to me.
Yeah,
I find like,
I love that.
Ariane Based or Corey Brecken or some of the other ones
Oh,
sweeter, even though they're higher proof. And so I find
yeah, yeah,
those
yeah.
easier to drink, but that's just my
I,
palate.
I love that. And everybody's palate is a little bit different. Um, French oak, interestingly, right? While we're talking about it, French oak being one of the components in the loudest barking dog in Corey Vrecken. French oak is actually quite sweet because it is really interestingly, the hemicellulose of French oak is very, very different than what you would see in American oak. American oak, you'll have a little bit more like oak lactone and lignin and less tannin. In French oak, much more tannin, but then there's also more there's basically more there's more like sugar that's accessible through the tyloses rings in French oak than there is in American oak. So even though American oaks oftentimes lend like their flavor profile to vanilla, cloves, cinnamon, and French oak, you may see things like apricot, maybe a little bit still some of that cinnamic acid as well. And then also a lot of this like big fiery clove and black pepper as well. And almost like lemon peel as well. So there is nuance and delicacy to French oak as well. So I'm 100% with you that Corey Vrecken, when you get past the 57.1% ABV of things, the structural integrity of that whiskey is very, very sweet and custardy as well. That whiskey responds beautifully to water. I wish it was in the lineup this evening, actually. I'm probably going to have a pour of it now that I've been talking about it as well.
This
Mm-hmm.
is actually my first time tasting Ardbeg, and
Love it.
I do find it very savory, and I like it very much. I'm kicking myself for not having it sooner.
I love that. I love it. I love it. Yeah, the savory elements of this whiskey. Again, we make the most heavily peated whiskey in regular production. Do have to specify that. If we want to talk about and nerd out about ppms, I'm more than happy to. But so Ardbeg, our barley comes to us from Port Ellen Malting Facility. We are not going to answer the phone from them unless they're calling to tell us that they have a batch of barley that's been malted or that has been peated to a level of 55 parts per million or above. Now, why that's really important, I think it is important, and I also think that it's not important at all. Right? Numbers are an interesting thing in Scotch whiskey because they prove and disprove theories. Where that number sounds very, very high, especially amongst our competitive set. Like think about a Lafroig, our next door neighbors or neighbors from 2 doors down. Their barley comes to them at about 45 to about 55 parts per million. So a very similar spec, very, very similar spec. Then you have somebody like Lagavulin and Lagavulin Distillery as well. Lagavulin Distillery, about 35 parts per million, right? So slightly lower ppm. Now, why I think that matters, but at the same time it doesn't really matter, is because those are pre-production numbers, right? So we haven't even talked about the barley being ground down and then being mashed, and then what you lose in fermentation, what you lose in distillation is massive. You lose a lot of ppm, and phenol is what we're referring to. You lose a lot of those in distillation, and then you'll continue to lose some in maturation, but then you'll also gain others from literally from the collision of like acids, fats, and then also some of them being rendered and pulled out of the structure of the oak itself. So by the time you get down to being able and being ready to bottle something like Ardbeg 10-year-old, that 55 ppms, you've lost a little over half. And you're talking probably down to about 25, maybe to about 30 parts per million. If you were to run what's called high performance liquid chromatography, HPLC, which is the method of measurement that they use on the raw ingredient itself, the barley itself. If you were to run that same process on the actual liquid, the end drink of whiskey, that number of post-process versus pre-process would not align, right? And so to me, it matters because we start really high at Ardbeg, but then through who we are as a distillery, we have a larger phenolic attrition or loss than any of the other distilleries on Islay. And where this starts and where I can kind of narrow that and pinpoint that down to, it's going to be the culprit of that is going to be a couple things. First off, wooden fermentation vessels. There aren't a whole lot of wooden fermentation vessels that are being utilized in Scotland in single malt Scotch whiskey production anymore. A fair amount of the ones on Islay do use wooden fermentation vessels, so we're not alone or unique there necessarily by any stretch of the imagination. A rather long fermentation time. Ardbeg's fermentation time is about 45 to 55 hours, depending on seasonality, right, and temperature as well. Rather a little bit long. Why that's really important is for that citrusy component that you start to see in a lot of the Ardbeg whiskeys. So you'll have what's called autolysis in fermentation, which is after about 37 hours, the yeast is now no longer the dominant microorganism. So it goes through something called autolysis, where it basically explodes from the inside out, and into that fermenting liquid, it spews what are called like LABs, lactobacillic acids, LBAs, right? Lactobacillic acids, or lactobacillica. And so that is where you start to see the acidity really skyrocket, right? So the pH drops in fermentation pretty aggressively after that. Then in distillation, this is where we are very unique. So Ardbeg is the only distillery that makes heavily peated whiskey in Scotland with what's called a purifier on our still. So basically, it's a little pot that hangs off of the line arm. So as you heat that still from the bottom, that liquid turns into a gas, phase change. The gas moves up through the body of the still, engaging and rubbing with copper, which is great at pulling out like sulfuric compounds out of solution. So the more copper contact you get, the lighter and more floral your whiskey will be. So that phase change has happened. Liquid moves up through the body of the still, out through the line arm, trying to make it to the condensers to be condensed back into a liquid. But before it can hit the condenser, there's a little pot that hangs off of the bottom of that line arm, and it grabs some of that spirit and it throws it back down into the bottom of the still to go through the process again, right? So that's where I believe Ardbeg is one of the most unique distilleries on the planet, because we can't tell you when that little piece of equipment went onto the stills, but we can tell you that it makes a massive amount of difference. And rather than tell you, I'll show you right now by switching gears and moving into our second whiskey, which will be Ardbeg's Heavy Vapors. So I got myself into a little bit of trouble when this whiskey was first released last year. I maybe had a couple of Ardbegs, maybe a couple of Corey Breckens, and I was in Facebook group chat mode or in Facebook whiskey watching group mode, and I was just seeing what people were saying about some of the new Ardbeg releases in whiskey group chats. And I saw that somebody had posted a scathing review of Heavy Vapors. And to me, this is one of the coolest whiskeys that we've made at Ardbeg in a very long time as well, because of the history of the whiskey and the history that goes along with it, right? So this was our committee release last year. And I think that, and even this person on Facebook, who I won't out, when I read their comment, their first comment was about the coloration of the whiskey. Oh, it's so incredibly light. How can you possibly call this Heavy Vapors when the whiskey is so incredibly light in coloration? And I should have immediately logged off, but I chose to respond. And my response was not very kind. It was not very kind. HR definitely had a meeting with me where they had printed off basically every comment that everything that I had said in my comment, read them all back to me, and I had no choice but to basically cop to saying, like, I absolutely did say all of those things because I believe in the whiskey so much. Now, Heavy Vapors, the name of the whiskey, actually comes from the idea of that purifier, right? That we have no idea when it was installed at the distillery, but we do know the function is that it ensures that the heart of the Ardbeg distillate is always characterized by light, floral, fruity esters and aromatic compounds that come across in the lightest vapors that we capture in the whiskey. Now, what would happen if we went back in time to about 1964, 65 is my educated guess on when the purifier went onto the stills at Ardbeg. What would happen if we went back to 1964, 65 and said, hold on, let's not put this piece of equipment onto the stills? How would that have changed the flavor profile and the interaction and engagement of the whiskeys that we make at Ardbeg? So Dr. Bill wanted to basically find out the answer to that. So he and Colin Gordon, well, actually at the time, it would have been Mickey Heads. This project was actually started by Mickey Heads and Dr. Bill. Mickey was the old distillery manager who retired a couple of years ago. So Dr. Bill and Mickey decided to pull the purifier off of the line arm at the distillery. This is the only time that it's ever been done since it went on to the stills back in, again, educated guess of about the 1960s, somewhere right in there. So this is Ardbeg minus the purifier. And you have to ask yourself a very similar question to the one we did at the very beginning of Ardbeg 10-year-old. Why is this whiskey so incredibly light in its coloration? if the oils and esters that we captured are heavier, more viscous, and weightier, one would stand to believe that they may be better solvents and better pulling out color contributing congeners out of the structure of the oak. Well, the reason that this whiskey is so incredibly light in color is because there is no first fill ex-bourbon here. There's no second fill. There's actually only third, fourth, and a little bit of fifth fill ex-bourbon barrel here as well, because we're not experimenting and solving for what happens in maturation. We're attempting to showcase how different the state of distillation for this whiskey was. And we don't change the still setup at Ardbeg very often. I mean, really, how can we? There are a couple of ideas that we've had that we've still got floating out there that I think Bill will be solving and answering very, very soon. But this is one of the really interesting and quite unique ones, is what would Ardbeg look like if we took off the mythical purifier that sets us so apart from any of the other distilleries in Scotland? What would our distillery look like if we took that piece of equipment off of the still? So let's find out right now together.
Wouldn't it also just be that, like, oh, sorry, Cameron, but wouldn't it be also just
no, go ahead, please.
Or that like you were saying, the aging in wood is orders of magnitude greater a factor than, just like you said, some of the compounds that may or may not pull more or less color out of the wood?
Yeah, so interestingly, I think that we do maturation-based experimentations all the time, right? Even Wee Beastie is technically a maturation-based experiment, right? Where it's, all right, the things that we're solving for is what happens when you reduce the amount of time of maturation, but you add in maybe a secondary cask style, right? We do the same thing like Ugadal, right? Is, again, maturation based. We didn't change the distillery setup or the distillery's operations. It's just that new made spirit goes into either ex-bourbon or some of it goes into Oloroso sherry casks, and we leave it alone. And then we reintroduce those things back to each other. Same thing for Corey Vrecken. Same thing for Ardbeg Anno, right? So playing with spirit profile to us is really illuminating an interesting territory, because it's not something that we do very often.
No, I mean,
now, I would have figured that had this whiskey gone into first fill or second fill ex-bourbon barrels, because it is more like oily, and almost maybe just a little bit more pleasantly sulfuric, that the resulting whiskey would be richer and bigger and more just fortified, I guess would probably be the best terminology for that. I'm sure that Bill probably set some of this whiskey aside into first fill and probably some into virgin American oak just to see what happens. But we won't have an answer for that until he decides to release that whiskey.
So how old is this?
Yeah, great question. So this is a non-age statemented whiskey. So legally, I cannot tell you the age, but the experiment in question may have happened back in about 2013. So we can make an educated guess as to if this whiskey was released in 2023 and the experiment was distilled in 2013, we can make the educated guess that it's around maybe 9 to 10 years old, right around there.
I think the name is perfect for it, because nose in the glass, you get one, but then whenever you tilt the glass sideways, you really get a lot more of the vapors off of.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I nosed it and then when I tasted it, that was two very different
experiences. Mm-hmm.
The flavor difference between this and the 10 is really quite interesting. It's almost like if you've ever made a sauce and done a reduction to concentrate the flavors, this has got that reduction kind of feeling to it.
Exactly.
I get a lot of citrus in this one. Lemon.
Yep, I agree. For me, it's like lemon and coal, especially on on the exhale after my initial sip, I can still feel it almost like crackling on the back part of my palate there. Almost something really herbal. There's just something almost like lemon verbena. There's something really, really green that's poking out of the glass at me as well. It's got a prickly kind of feel. Yeah.
Oh, there was something I wanted to ask before, Cameron, real quick, going back a bit, which was just out of curiosity, you said, and I've heard you say this before, and it just occurred to me this time. The first thing you use are your eyes when you look at a whiskey. And I was thinking about it. I'm like, the thing is with any sort of whiskey, because at least either aged, because unaged is just clear. Aged, you've got like pale to yellow to gold to maybe kind of reddish, but it's a fairly narrow band, and it's a spirit and you can see through it. Have you heard of anybody or in the whiskey space thinking of doing something to play with what the spirit looks like that obviously wouldn't affect the flavor? The first thought that came to my mind was obviously, Goldschlager, you put in edible gold flakes or something. But then I was like, something potentially crazy like making the whiskey refract somehow or something so it just catches your eye more. Like, have you heard of anyone trying to do anything like in that space, or is that just not something anyone's messing with?
This is such a great question. I love you for it. So there's a governing body, the SWA, the Scotch Whisky Association, and the SWA is the governing body that oversees and legislates what you can and cannot do in Scotch whiskey. And Dr. Bill loves, even though he is on the governing body and on the board, he absolutely loves to interpret the rules as he sees fit. But the rules and regulations in Scotch whiskey are written very, very beautifully and very well, where there is room for interpretation, but not room for bastardization, I think is probably the best way. So like, for instance, a whiskey that we all know very, very well, Glenmorangie Quinta Ruban. If you were to ask the SWA what is the furthest departure away from the classic color spectrum that's attributed to Scotch whiskey that they feel comfortable allowing the greatest amount of variance, their answer would be Glenmorangie's Quinta Ruban, right? Because it does not bear the classic coloration of that pale yellow, auric gold, maybe slightly copper teen, maybe a little bit of like gold thrushing kind of into the corners there as well. But a pink rosacea kind of hue, the one that, like you'll see in Quinta Ruban, is very far from the norm. And so that is as far away from the normal spectrum of colors as you can paint a whiskey in single malt Scotch whiskey legally. This is why you won't see like Glenmorangie Baja Blast or something like that, is because legally the SWA will say, look, this is not the classic color characteristic, or also the previous occupant of this that was in this barrel, we do not recognize as one that is legally able to be used in single malt Scotch whiskey. So like, we couldn't use a Midori cask right now if we wanted to. Couldn't use it. We couldn't use that. I'd imagine in the future, there's going to be somebody who finds a loophole and kind of a way to circumnavigate that. I'll use Bill again as another example. Glenmorangie's Tale of Forest. The SWA really got upset at the fact that Bill went back in the history books and said, well, look, classically, people would have used anything that burned to dry their malted barley. It wouldn't have only been peat that they used. So this is why he was able to release a whiskey that we used Highland botanicals, things like juniper berry, like juniper bush, thistle as well. Things that the SWA really took kind of an aggressive stance with him on that whiskey, because they said that it sounds like you're flavoring the whiskey and you're not allowed to add any additional flavor to a single malt Scotch whiskey. And he says, no, we're not adding flavor. We're adding flavor through traditional malting practice that would have existed pre-SWA regulation. So it's a really great question. But that, I mean, I know it was a little bit of a jumbled answer, but that's the best I can kind of relay it to you.
Which is just,
yeah.
So flavor I get, but do they actually have regulations about the color allowed? If it didn't change the flavor?
Yeah, so you're only allowed to add E150A. E150A is the specific caramel coloring compound that you can use. You cannot use any other one other than that specific one, because the assumption is that it doesn't change in any noticeable or discernible way the flavor profile of the whiskey itself. And then coloration.
Could you throw diamonds? Could you throw diamonds in your Scotch? Just I'm going on. I'm
sure you could. Yeah, I'm sure you could put diamonds in the bottom of your bottle if you wanted to. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely you could. But in terms of like changing the physical coloration of the whiskey itself, or like making it opalescent or like shiny or sheeny, they're not going to go for that. They're not going to go for that. Yeah.
No opal glitter powder.
No opal glitter powder. But I mean, like, there's an independent bottler who we all know and love very much so, Blackadder. Blackadder, they barrel at cask strength with pieces of the barrel and left in solution. So down in the bottom of your bottle, you'll often times have like little black flecks of char as well down in the bottom of your bottle. But that's the only time that I've seen something with any sort of like flocculent or like flocculation in the bottle itself.
Yeah, you missed
Great question.
Since you don't have your camera where you can see the screen, David pulled out a couple of the bottles you were talking about, so everybody looking at the screen was able to see the color you were talking about.
I love that. Yeah, it is really a beautiful color. Like that Quinta Ruban. The first time I saw that, I was just like, that cannot be whiskey. It's pink. It looked like if somebody had juiced like a pluot or a plum and mixed it in with the whiskey. I absolutely adore that whiskey. Speaking of adoring the whiskey, this is drinking just really beautifully for me right now. I haven't opened up one of these in maybe a month or two, and this made me very, very, very happy that Bill and Jillian and the whiskey creation team were experimenting with spirit capture at the distillery.
Yeah. I think this has got to be one of the most interesting Ardbegs I've had. It's so different.
Yeah.
And yet
exactly.
It has all of the characteristics that you would absolutely know it's Ardbeg. It's just different.
Exactly. Yeah. It was so interesting. The first time that we tried this as an ambassador team, I remember tasting it and I was just like, this is clearly an Ardbeg, and I know it's an Ardbeg, but it just drinks a little bit left field, a little bit more. It's just, I think you put it exactly right, where everything just feels maybe a little bit more concentrated and just has a little bit more gravitas. Righteous. Well, shall we push forward into our next drum?
Oh, yes, please.
Let's do it. Nice. Ardbeg Wee Beastie. So I told you that the distillery was famed for a little bit of illegal or illicit distillation that was happening back in the 1790s and so on and such forth as well. The farm that the distillery, or the plot of land that the distillery is built on, It's called Arnhem Based. We've mentioned that now a couple of times. There's a very famed and iconic bottling called Ardbeg Arnhem Based from the early parts of the 2000s. Most of it distilled in 1990 and a little bit of it in 1989 as well. But just an iconic whiskey. If you ever get an opportunity to grab one of them or even try one of them, please absolutely do yourself a favor. It's Ardbeg as it's Ardbeg's best rendition as a dreamsicle, I think, is probably how I would describe that. It's creamy and rich and sultry. It's just texturally just a beautiful, beautiful whiskey. And also 1990 was an interesting production year for the distillery. First full production year after closures in the 1980s. So a piece of living history there. Now, Arnhem Based itself actually means home of the beast, an iconic piece of land and plot of land where there are many mythical and mysterious creatures who have lived and dotted the southern side of the island. There's actually a very famed story of a mythical animal called the harpy that actually lives on the southern side of the island and is alleged to be one of the inhabitants of the home of the beast at Arnhem Based. Hence why we also made a whiskey last year called Ardbeg Harpy's Tale. But the reason that I tell that story is because a couple of years ago, actually all through the mid 2000 teens, somewhere right around in there, when Ardbeg really started to become one of the it girls or the haute couture at the time, if you will, we had a lot of people who said, well, why isn't Ardbeg releasing more age statemented whiskey, more age statemented whiskey, more age statemented whiskey? And to me, older doesn't necessarily mean better. It means different. Absolutely. 1,000%. And so at the time, in about 2019, Dr. Bill and the Whiskey Creation team gave me a phone call and they said, hey, Cam, we're working on this project. We'd like to send you some samples. So I got home one day and there's a big box outside, 25 different samples. We start opening them up, had a bunch of friends over, start sampling everything. It was basically 5 families, A, B, C, D, and E, 5 families, 5 samples. So A1 through A5, E1 through E5. We eliminated a lot of the outliers, things that were just too big, too strong, maybe a little too soft, too watery. We were left with a couple of different a couple of different finalists. What we ended up selecting was actually the whiskey that Dr. Bill and the Whiskey Creation team also really enjoyed. So we helped the Whiskey Creation team create Ardbeg Wee Beastie. Effectively, it's about 60% ex-bourbon barrels. So whiskeys that you've seen before already to this point, right? Maybe not in heavy vapors, because heavy vapors was, again, removing the purifier from the still, but you've seen ex-bourbon barrel at work before in Ardbeg 10-year-old, right? So it's about 60% whiskey that's in line to become Ardbeg 10-year-old. The other 40% is actually whiskey that's been wholly matured in Oloroso sherry casks. Instead of being first fill Oloroso sherry casks, these are second fill Oloroso sherry casks, right? So it's a large percentage of the whiskey spends time in sherry, but it's not first fill. It's already had a previous occupant. So a lot of the color contributing congeners and the coloration of the sherry has gone to this previous occupant. It's a little bit like if you've ever made, like, we'll use sauces again, right? It's a little bit like if you've made a pan sauce, right? If you're gonna take the renderings from whatever was cooked in that pan before, you're gonna deglaze that pan with whatever your liquid is going to be and reconstitute that. Casks work very, very similarly. Let's take an Oloroso sherry cask, for example, right? That sherry cask would have been used by a sherry house. A sherry house probably would have used that cask if it was in like Solera styled system. They'd have used it quite frequently. Even if it was a single barrel, they would have used it for multiple vintages. Then after you disgorge and you empty that sherry, trapped inside of the structure of that oak, the previous occupant has given us pieces of itself. It's left pieces of itself trapped within that oak. The next occupant that you put into that barrel is going to reconstitute and pull all of those things out of the hemicellulose and back into the heart of the cask with the other liquid. Hence why things like Ugadal, or even things like some of the Lafroigs that are heavily sherried, or maybe even some of the Bamors that are heavily sherried, take on this little bit more golden, a little bit more coppertine and umbered and ambered coloration to them. It's because they're benefiting from the previous occupant that was in there. Now, what happens if you then empty that whiskey and then refill that ex-sherry cask again with single malt? Well, there are going to be, again, pieces of that previous occupant that were still left in solution and still left inside of the hemicellulose of that oak that the new occupant can also take advantage of. So that's why even at 5 years old, Ardbeg Wee Beastie is much darker than Ardbeg 10-year-old. I'd say that this now really takes just a little bit of that coppered coloration. It's almost like a little bit of ambering, like almost like a little bit of ambered or mapled syrup has crept into the corners of the glass here. On the nose, this is where you're going to find some of the largest differences as well. On the nose, very much so honeyed. There's something meaty about this whiskey as well. Very, very savory. I'm just absolutely just in love with this whiskey. What are your thoughts on the nose here?
I've got like almost a honey baked ham.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that it's ham, but it's that kind of aroma. Like, so I get what you mean by meaty. That makes more sense. A bit of that marrow that you talked about with the 10 as well.
Yep, exactly. And it's a sliding scale as well, right? Because when we first started, we thought Ardbeg 10-year-old drank quite meaty and very savory. And then we had heavy vapors, and we saw concentration of some of those sulfuric compounds up front. Now we're getting a conversation of like sulfurs and other meaty characteristics, but it's not distillation based. These are coming from maturation, right? So the source of savory is a little bit different, but the way that it registers on the palate, I think, is just absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah.
I think it drinks very sweet to me.
Agreed. Absolutely.
I'm a fan of that.
Yeah.
It's definitely the most like barbecue. You mentioned that earlier, started liking of anything. And I don't know if it's just the suggestion of ham that makes me think of ham.
Well, I mean, if sweet and that, yeah, you end up with barbecue. And,
no, 100%.
Yeah.
But I don't.
Agreed.
And as a result, I find it. You know, I was thinking about this question earlier in my own head when you were talking about it. Sort of, you know, peaty Scotch is always the hardest to convince people to get into or try. And it's sort of one of those things that's like seems to be either you like it or you don't. You know, it's like cilantro or lavender. Like, well, it can be polarizing. And then when I try to, you know, not that you want to suggest notes, when you try to describe to somebody, you know, like, you know, bourbon is, you know, brown sugar molasses, you know, whatever it is. But with peat, it's like the phrases you hear, you know, just taste the iodine and Band-Aids in it. You know, that's a fucking hard sell on somebody who's like, be like, it tastes like Band-Aids, get into it, you know. But so I've been thinking about like, what are the other tasting notes to try to get somebody to get into it. And I'm liking the salinity. Yeah. I'm liking the savory, you know, just something for someone, you know, because, you know, and I'm talking about somebody who's willing to get into it, not somebody who's like, fuck that, my mind's closed, but like, okay, if I'm going to get into Pete, what should I look for besides just, you know, the automatic, what hits you in the mouth? What's going to be, and I do agree. I always go for that salt note because I agree with that, but sort of the savory, barbecuey, I usually find that more with American smoked than I do with this is definitely the first one of the single malt here, but those are sort of what I'm looking for in this is, especially with you who is so good at translating. It's it's hard to translate flavor to words always, and everyone's palate is different, but sort of helping somebody know, here's what you should look for in this one, or here, taste this thing, because with anyway, long way of saying I'm liking it. It's helping me sort of solve that in my brain.
Absolutely. We this year is going to be such a great. I'm so excited about 2024 for us as a brand as well, because we get to do some things that we haven't done in quite a while, right? So years ago we were known for our vehicle tours, right? We've had a rocket ship, we've had the choppers, we've had the armored vehicles, we've had a tour bus. This year we're going to have an Airstream that'll be touring the country, that has a experience that we call Masters of Smoke, that's built into it. And its goal is basically to do exactly that, which is vocalize and verbalize the categories of smoke, which at Ardbeg, we believe that there are 5 families of smoke that are relevant to play in, and that smoke isn't a one-dimensional flavor just by itself. We think that smoke can be savory, coal, herbal, medicinal, or woody. Those are the 5 different families of smoke for us. So this Airstream, or Ardstream, as we're calling it, will actually have all 5 of the families, and then take people who go inside of it on like a Masters of Smoke quiz to find what style of smoke they are most drawn to, and then which whiskey speaks loudest in that area as well. So I'm very, very excited for that. One of the things that I will send to Vadim as well, as soon as we wrap up here as well, is a piece of equipment that we call the periodic table. So it's basically a periodic table that has elements that you will find in all of our whiskeys. And so it's great for being able to familiarize yourselves with aromatics and flavors that you've had that you want to be able to recall through the element of whiskey, right? One of the beautiful things about drinking and about eating is the way that our human bodies work, right? Our olfactory epithelium, the small bulb that's a cluster of like nodules that catalog basically every single smell and aromatic profile you've ever experienced, that communicates at light speed with your memory. It's actually, in terms of the human body, one of the closest and one of the fastest firing sets of synapses. So your ability to smell and then recall aromatics are 2 of the most fast functioning attributes that human beings have. And actually in women, it actually is even more intensified. Women are actually better at smelling and recalling than most men are. There are actually more women in the world who are super tasters than there are men. But I actually find it really interesting that this year for us is going to be all about experiencing and expressing and finding out what we love about whiskey through previous engagements that we've had with things that we've smelled, tasted, or nosed as well. So I'm super excited for us all to be able to experience Masters of Smoke, and I'll make sure that periodic table finds its way to Vadim so he can kick that out there as well.
That sounds really fascinating.
When I talk about it with my friends, do I have to say herbal or can I say herbal? Because I don't want to get I don't want to
I know, yeah, you know what? You get smacked up. Yeah, exactly. Either that or you'll be, exiled. You'll be an expat here. You'll have to move over to the UK or over to London. Nice. So we thought it was a little bit sweeter on the palate than Heavy Vapors and Ardbeg 10-year-old as well. Anything else on the palate really stick out?
I thought this one had the longest finish for me. That I've got a lot of the sherry on the nose. The palate, not as much sherry itself, but just that sweetness, but that just lingered for a really long time on the palate.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, those are all bang on, all really, really bang on comments. I thought that on the nose, it read like the sherry was going to be much more integral to the center palate and the front palate focus. And there is very soft presence of sherry on the palate, but it's not nearly as formidable as it laid itself out to be on the nose. And then the staying power and the finish of this whiskey, especially at the bottling proof, 47.4, it is nowhere near cask strength. It is young, but this whiskey to me just has just this really gripping aspect to it. And to me, this is how young Ardbeg should taste. Love it. Now, in the idea of something old and something new, we've done the something new, so let's jump into something a little bit older as well here. I think starting with batch number 4 of the Trayvon series makes the most sense, and then jumping into batch number 5. To do that, I'm so sorry that my actual real camera is not working. Otherwise, it would be focusing in on the label down there. Lots of hidden elements and elements of discovery baked into the brands at Ardbeg. If you were to take a bottle of even say like Ardbeg 10-year-old and hold it label out away from you, the bottom left side of that bottle in very faint etching, laser etching in the back left side of that bottle, you'd find what's called an L code. The L codes. The L codes were very important, and they are still very important. If you are a massive fan of the brand or have some old bottles and you want to figure out just what the heck was going on around the distillery and also what line they were bottled on, you can actually go on to a website that we do not own the IP for, but it's called ardbegproject.com. ardbegproject.com. And the gentleman who owns Ardbeg Project is actually a massive, massive fan of the brand. Really great man, actually, and one of the living historians on behalf of the brand. Actually, I've hit him up a couple of times when there have been things that I needed to know, and he's also starred in a couple of photo shoots for the brand as well. So, ardbegproject.com, you can actually find out a lot of the L codes of your older Ardbeg bottles. Just go on and look up the actual bottle, which whiskey it is, and it'll tell you a lot of each bottling series or each L series that existed for it. So because of that, because of the enthusiasm behind the L codes, we wanted to keep some of those elements of discovery, but make them a little bit more forward on this series. So this whiskey is called Ardbeg Trayvon. Trayvon. Traigh space BAN. Trayvon. And that actually means beach of the fair-haired maiden or beach of the blonde. And on the beach of the blonde, on really, really windy days, you can actually hear a faint maiden's kind of whistling or humming. And then that's actually because the grains of sand are so fine that as the wind sweeps across the beach, it actually forces these granules to kind of vibrate against one another. And so there's another name for them, the singing sands at the beach of the blonde or beach of the fair-haired maiden. It's a beautiful white sand beach on islets on the kind of like middle of the island on the west side of the island. Absolutely gorgeous. So that's the name of the whiskey, Trayvon. Now you'll find that down at on the lower label, this white label, there'll be a couple of elements of discovery. First off, there will be a roundel or an icon. This roundel changes with every single batch of this whiskey. So and it's always a roundel or an icon that is significant to the distillery itself. Then you'll find the initials of the whiskey, TB/04. That means that this is the 4th batch. And then it'll give you a series of numbers, 07 03 2003. And that's the date of distillation, 7th day of the 3rd month of 2003. Slash 22 tells you the date of release. So this was released in 2022. CG, as much as I would love for those to be my initials, unfortunately they are not. That tells you the distillery manager, or the person who was actually overseeing this batch of whiskey and its construction. So just to vet that against batch number 5, GM, Jillian McDonald, are the initials at the end of batch number 5. And then it'll also tell you a little bit about the state of the distillery and the conditions on the island when it was being bottled. So let's see if I can remember all these. There's 5 of them now. All right. Batch number 1 was bottled during a storm. Batch number 2 would have been bottled during I'm going to have to come back to that one. Batch number 3 was bottled during a lockdown. Batch number 4 bottled during a full moon. Batch number 5 being bottled. God, I'm so out of practice. It's been a couple of months since we've done all 5 of these next to each other. Batch number 5 bottled in a humidity. Batch number 2 is going to escape me for right now. I'm going to have to come back to that one. But we give you a little bit of about the state of bottling during or the state of the island during the bottling itself. Now, I'm very excited for these 2 whiskeys side by side or one after another. If you have 2 glasses and you feel like pouring them side by side, please do. If you've only got the 1 glass, take your time with it. No need to rush at all. These are absolutely incredible drams. Batch number 4 and batch number 5 are a little bit different from each other, even though they use the same ingredients. I'm going to use air quotes there, the same ingredients. They are both comprised of mainly ex-bourbon. Batch number 4 has a little bit more sherry than batch number 5 has a little bit more sherry than batch number 4 did. But again, it's not very much. The lion's share of both of these whiskeys was aged and matured in ex-bourbon barrel. Very excited for us to kind of dive into these together. So cheers and Slanjava to the oldest whiskeys on our tasting here this evening. Any thoughts on the nose or the color of the whiskey as well, right off of the bat? Colorations for
dark,
me.
I would expect
Almost.
for a 19, right?
Agreed. Not as dark as I would have thought it would have gone. Agreed. It also tells us that the sherry influence on these are probably going to be fairly light, right? Because 19 years in sherry cask would have really, just really intensified, reconstituted itself, and refortified itself with coloration. And it's just not the case. And I've seen one of the darkest whiskeys that I've ever seen at Ardbeg was actually an 8-year-old Pedro Jimenez sherry cask sample. And again, a very different style of sherry, right? But even at 8 years old, that whiskey was almost diesel fueled jet black. It was incredibly beautiful whiskey in its glass. It was beautiful. Ardbeg, again, most of the whiskey that we have sitting at the distillery matured in ex-bourbon barrel.
So I've got some notes in the chat here. Jeff said that he thought the B4 is much sweeter on the nose than the B5. Lavelle said the sherry does come through in the 5, a nice compliment. Jason is getting some biscuity notes on the 4. David,
yes, agreed. Biscuity brioche.
Yeah, I almost got shortbread on the 4.
Yeah.
David said that he and his son got roses and red vines on the B4 with some Christmas spices.
Roses and red vines. What a tasting note. Roses and red vines. That's beautiful.
That was a good one.
So, Cameron, so the batch 2, what does it mean bottled under a thick hour?
There it is. I knew I was missing one. Thick mist.
Oh, H-O-H.
Yeah.
Okay, it's tiny little print. I'm old.
Yeah, it's tiny, tiny, tiny little print.
Under
Yeah,
a thick R.
R. Yeah,
Very good.
thick R. Yeah. So they were basically saying that, yeah, during the bottling, there again must have been that cold air and warm air front just kind of hitting each other over the island and creating a really thick mist.
And this is a Mickey Heads bottle.
Yeah, that's a Mickey. Yeah, that's a Mickey Heads bottle. We love Mickey.
These
Yeah, we
descriptors
absolutely
seem more
Mickey was.
poetic than anything, right, Cameron?
What was that?
These descriptors seem more poetic than anything.
Exactly. Yeah, they're more poetic than anything. The tasting notes down at the bottom of the bottle, I actually agree with a lot of them. On the white label, the lower label. So batch number 4, for instance, rich wood smoke, menthol, and anise seed. Which I agree with. I'm still very partial to roses and red vines. That's just what a tasting note. That's going into my back pocket right there. That's a beautiful tasting note. Notes of sweet mango, maple, bacon, and soot on batch number 5, which again I agree with as well, very much so. The coloration, batch 5 is a little bit darker than batch 4 was. Not that that really matters. On the nose, definitely more menthol and more mentholic, which stands to reason. Like to me, that's a fairly American, an American oak or Corcus alba driven tasting note is like menthol. So it stands to reason that there's a bit more of a mentholic characteristic on batch 4 because there was more American oak than in batch number 5, which had a little bit more sherry. Again, stands to reason why batch 5 is maybe a little bit just a skosh darker in terms of the coloration, even though the bottling proofs are very, very similar. And then also the tropical mangoed honeyed sweetness of batch number 5 to me is very indicative of the sherry cask being quite robust here.
So I have a couple more questions for you from the chat. My
Please.
other fellow gal on the chat here, masquerading as Stephen Weller, says, is there a difference in the level of peat between these two?
Great question. No. Nope. No difference. Barley, same exact barley, 55 parts per million. No difference in the barley. Same exact classical Ardbegian operation. So fermentation time, the exact same. Mashing, the exact same. Milling, the exact same. Distillation, the exact same. The only differences are going to be the amount of sherry to ex-bourbon cask that's utilized in the bottling of the whiskey.
Okay.
Yeah, so on B5, I thought the peat was very subtle to me. I mean, I think that would be a very good whiskey to introduce someone to Ardbeg with, because you get those Ardbeg peat flavors, but not as strong. You get a lot more of those other underlying whiskey flavor too.
Yeah, I agree. I think batch 5 is, dare I say, like maybe a little bit softer and maybe just a little bit more like refined, even less rustic than batch number 4. So I agree. Batch 5 would be a great introductory point. I really like batch number 5. If you haven't had it, batches, if you haven't had all 5 batches, please find a way to try all 5 of them. Batch number 3 is really kind of my speed.
Isn't that just
My
tasting
favorite
at your house,
of
Cameron?
the whiskeys. Yeah, that is tasting at my house. Yeah, exactly. All right, come on up to Seattle. You're invited. Yeah.
There we go. See some other notes for you. Lavelle gets cake on the 4. Tony,
Absolutely, cake.
Tony,
Yeah.
Tony says 4 is more fruit cake. 5 is sort of like carrot cake.
I can see that too.
Yeah, that would make sense.
The tasting notes here are beautiful tonight. These are amazing tasting notes this evening.
Jason notes that there's a big difference on the palate between the two of them for him, and that Henrik and Alana thinks that 100% she agrees with the notes for B4. Tony tried to Doppler water in B5 and said that it opened up nicely. And
Yep.
David said that for he and his son, the peat is more prominent in the 5 than the 4.
Mm. I'll drop a little bit of water in mine as well here. See what happens. Why not? This is why this is one of the things, especially like older whiskeys. The older a whiskey gets, especially after about 12 years, you will start to lose phenol because they have a half-life in maturation. Ones that were resilient enough to make it through the entire process, ones that came from their genesis point was the malting process. After about, if they were strong enough to survive all the way up into maturation, after about 12 years, you'll start to lose them and they'll kind of like start to degrade. So a heavily peated whiskey that's about 19 years old, you're going to have seen much, much more phenolic loss and attrition. So whereas like the 10-year-old was down to about 30 parts per million, here we're talking, if we ran HPLC, probably down to about 15. So you've lost a lot of that rich smokiness. And at the same time, there's fragility that you start to have to consider as well. So this is why, especially when I'm drinking like older, heavily peated whiskeys and just older whiskey in general, my first inclination is not to add water immediately, right? Because I can't take the water back out. I just can't do it. So I generally, especially with older whiskeys, I'm a little bit more hesitant to add water to them. But for the sake of exploration this evening, I think it will beg and answer some pretty interesting questions here. On the nose, there was no real change when I added water, maybe just a little bit more like creosote and graphite and pencil shaving on batch 4. Same thing, batch 5. It did mute the sweetness of the mango and like tropical fruit kind of is lost a little bit more now.
I'm just one glassing it tonight, so I've just gotten to the 5. I get the sherry on it, but it's also got some notes of elderflower.
Yeah, I like
really
that.
interesting,
Beautiful.
super light, but just a little bit sweet floral. But it still has that bone marrow barbecue note to it as well. I mean, it's a really fascinating whiskey. Now I need 1 through 3.
Exactly.
I also feel it has
oftentimes
have a very long finish to both of them.
Yeah. To both of them, I agree. Yeah, both of them are they stick around just a little bit as well. People always ask, like, is there a big difference between batches 1 through 5? And it's my resounding answer is always yes. Like it is not just us slapping a new label on the same product every single year. There are massive, massive differences. I mean, this is back-to-back vintages side by side, let alone all 5. At the distillery, Jackie messaged us a couple of months ago. They found a couple of additional cases of batches 1 and 2, and they actually used the tasting mat and a lot of the resources that I created here for our team here in the US to do vertical flights of like batches 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now they're doing the same thing at the distillery as well. So if you've got a distillery trip planned this year, that's one of the experiences you should definitely sign up for, is a vertical of all of the 19s.
That sounds marvelous.
Mm-hmm. And that elderflower note is when I added water, it didn't pronounce itself on the nose, but on the palate, that elderflower kind of white flower sweet sweetness is right there.
Yeah,
incredible whiskey, right? So those are 2 of the oldest age statemented whiskeys that we make. Last year, our oldest age statemented whiskey, Ardbeg 25, which I have somewhere around here. You should be right here, my friend. There you are. You were just up high. Ardbeg 25 last year ended up winning and taking home a very prestigious award at the New York Wine and Spirits competition, winning best whiskey in the world. So our old age statemented whiskeys turn out to be pretty darn good sometimes, it looks like. So I'm very, very happy that we make all of those whiskeys, and that we make the entire series of the Trevans. There will be another batch coming up later on this year. Other than that, I can't tell you anything else about it. But I'm very excited for this batch as well. And then, as always, we will also do another run of Ardbeg 25. And so that run will probably be a little after Ardbeg Day, maybe around August, hitting the US here as well. So the 25, if you are into it, please let me know, and I can find a way to connect you to a vendor or retailer that will have some of that whiskey as well. Also, another incredible dram.
So, Cameron, I have a question about the. So, speaking of older aged whiskeys, has there ever been any talk of bringing back the 17? Because that stuff was so good.
I refuse to get myself fired on this chat. Watch this space. Watch that space. Watch it very, very closely. Yeah.
I was going to say,
that's all I'll say.
You can always stop the recording too, and
Yeah, I can always pause. That's a good question, Rebecca.
Exactly. It's a very, very good question. With the recording going, that's the most diplomatic answer that I can give. But if you really love that whiskey, then this could be a very exciting year for you.
Very diplomatic, Cameron. I like it.
Yeah, exactly. I love that question though, because I genuinely, the 17s are some of the most iconic whiskey that we ever made. And that whiskey was just so incredible. It's so delicious. That and Arnhem Bashed, and then Renaissance were some of the first whiskeys that I absolutely just flipped head over heels for as well. So much like you, I am a very big fan of the 17. And so this is a great year for both of us. Yeah.
Well, I haven't had the pleasure, so I'll have to look forward to something this year. That sounds awesome.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, as we get close,
how's everybody doing on their batch 5?
I was going to say that batch 5 is fabulous. That is so wonderful. I think that might be my favorite, but we'll see.
Well, we're going to end with a bang then here as well, because this whiskey is. I thought about slotting it in right after Wee Beastie, as we were kind of talking about, Benno, but ultimately, I think it is right to end with this whiskey because of the palate presence and the heft of it. So Ardbeg's Anamorphic. There were a couple of whiskeys. I thought last year was just such a great year of releases, even though the public-facing release of Heavy Vapors may not have been as wonderfully and beautifully received as I would have hoped it would have been. I think for the Ardbeg fans and the Ardbegians who understood what we were playing at, and for all of us here this evening, we understand why that whiskey is so incredible and why it's so delicious as well. And going into it with optimism rather than looking to maybe pick fights, I think that whiskey was absolutely incredible. To me, Heavy Vapors was actually the 3rd best release of the year last year. I liked it a lot. I think it was great whiskey. And I waffle back and forth between what 1 and 2 would be. The other one that I would say probably has a large stake in my heart is Ardbeg's Bizarrebecue. I thought that this whiskey was just stunning. It's an absolutely just incredible whiskey, a marriage of distilling and grilling. It was so Ardbeg. It was so on the nose. And then the other whiskey that I thought really just was absolutely stunning and really incredible as well was Ardbeg Anamorphic. You know, Harpy's Tail, which we also released last year, I thought was a good whiskey. I thought it was a great whiskey. I love Sauterne Cask. Sauterne sweetness and Ardbeg, I really think go hand in hand together. And it's not to say that whiskey is not incredible, but I just think that Barbecue and Anamorphic were such rock stars and such stellar whiskeys from the whiskey creation team that these were obviously the two runaways. To me, the most beautiful element of this whiskey actually happens before I even raise it to my glass. Actually happens as the whiskey is flowing in. To me, this is a very, very dark, rich coloration for an Ardbeg, especially one that doesn't bear an older age statement to it. To me, this is like retro, almost in terms of the coloration, is like almost older stock of Corey Vrecken. Some of the very first Corey Vrecken batches that came out were about this coloration to them as well. Now Corey Vrecken's even a little bit darker, but this light kind of brown with kisses of like gold in the corners here as well are just some of my absolute favorite whiskeys. And then on the nose of it as well, you've got this beautiful mocha espresso, and the idea that human beings are a microcosm of their own lived experiences. I can only start and express this whiskey with mine. So growing up here in Seattle, the home of Seattle's best coffee and Starbucks, the Starbucks roastery being mere blocks away from where I grew up as a kid, it always smelled a little bit like mocha or espresso. I'm not the biggest coffee fan, but I love the aromatic of roasted or roasting coffee beans. I think is absolutely incredible. So roasted espresso or coffee beans that then meets something maybe a little bit sodden, maybe something a little bit like vegetal as well. I think artichoke is one of the most apropos and kind of on the nose nosing elements of this whiskey. So there's something big and sweet, and then almost bittered coffee, and then vegetal. It's just such an absolutely incredible whiskey for us as well. Now, the bottling proof here, Ardbeg, we love our strange proofs. Even our filling strength is a little bit strange, right? Most distilleries in Scotland go in at about 62.5, somewhere right around there. At Ardbeg, we go in at 62.7. We believe that extra 0.2% actually it does add a little bit of a difference. So oftentimes you will see Ardbegs being bottled at fairly strange bottling proofs: 47.4, 57.1, 54.2. Ardbeg 10-year-old being bottled at 46. This whiskey, Anamorphic, being bottled at 48.2%, is a very strange bottling strength for us. Again, nowhere near cask strength, but just enough so that it's non-chill filtered, and there's enough of this grippy kind of fattiness to extend the palate profile and the longevity of the palate profile as well there. So I really hope that you enjoy this whiskey. Please nose away. Tell me what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear.
And while we're thinking about that, if everyone could come back on camera, I would love to get a group photo of everyone here with us this evening. There's a lot of really interesting comments in the chat. Let me see, let me scroll backwards here. Jeff said he got a lot of chocolate from the Anamorphic. David said it's like Starburst on the nose with dark chocolate on the tongue. Tony thinks it's like an 80% dark chocolate. See, Rebecca said like a dark smoked chocolate. Henrik and Alana think it's an absolute buy. Jeff says this is the signet of Ardbeg.
Yes. Absolutely. Signet of Ardbeg. Yeah. And again, like we tried at face value, most people would have assumed that that Ardcore would have been the signet of Ardbeg, right? Because signet, high roasted chocolate malt, you basically roast the barley like coffee beans. Yeah, and that's what Ardcore was. A little bit of that barley that went into Ardcore had been roasted as like high roasted chocolate malt is what they call it. But it didn't have the like weight and the texture and the mouthfeel that I was really looking for. This has it all. It has that big toffee and espresso. I love that starburst comment as well. For me, there's almost something like eating like a what is it, the yellow starburst and a piece of like chocolate, like dark chocolate at the same time. That sweet, almost like banana yellow. It's not really banana flavored, but that sweet banana air quotes flavor, and then also the chocolate mixing together at the same time. That to me is this whiskey. So I love that somebody called it the signet of Ardbeg, because I think it's bang on.
Awesome. All right, everybody, raise a glass. Let's give Cameron a big cheers, and thank you so much for being here with us. We're not done by any means, Cameron. I just want to make sure I get a good picture for video. Okay, I got it. Now you can turn your cameras off if you're desperate.
So that's where I'm getting kind of like the cocoa powder on the nose for this one.
Again, the lion's share of this whiskey is just ex-bourbon. The modifying casks here, though, because again, at Ardbeg, we don't finish whiskeys. That's what Glenmorangie does. We work in whole components that are aged separately. So some of this whiskey went into ex-bourbon. Some of it went into casks that actually had been toasted aggressively. High toast and then a very aggressive char. And then there were also some casks where we actually spiral cut grooves, air quotes, into the actual top of the casks. Years ago, we did an experiment called Ardbeg called Grooves as well, which was just an absolute incredible whiskey. So not to confuse it with that. But the reason why we cut spirals into the top of those casks was actually to expand the surface area that the spirit could engage with, right? And even though those casks had been used before, when you cut away in like a spiral kind of pattern, you're revealing unused oak, or oak that hadn't been penetrated or permeated by the spirit that was resting in it previously. So it's a way of like rejuvenating or revitalizing a cask while also giving it more surface area to for the spirit to engage with. The more surface area means the more extractables. The more extractables, the more concentration, hence the coloration, and also the rich espresso and cocoa powder and almost like the spice of this whiskey as well.
This is really fantastic stuff. I missed a question earlier. Lavelle was wondering, is it more difficult to get your hands on the B4 or the B5?
I think it depends on where you live. For instance, like I don't think there's anybody here from Florida because it'd be quite late for Floridians. But like Tony's
in Florida.
Yeah. Tony's in Florida.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then Tony will be able to buy all of the batch 4, because there was a lot of batch 4 in Florida when I was down there in early December. There was a lot of it. Also, Tony, buy ticket to Whiskey X Festival. Whiskey X is the first whiskey festival of the year for us. I'll be down. I think it is that first week in March. So we'll be doing a bunch of events and activations, and I'll have the art stream down in Florida. That'll be the first market that it's visiting, is actually down near Miami, that first week in March. So, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It's difficult to gauge where in the country is going to be easier. Florida, I just know offhand that there was a pretty good amount of batch 4, because when I sold some into a couple of accounts, they received batch, when I was trying to sell in batch 5, they received batch 4 accidentally. So I had to go to the distributor and say, all right, well, like how much batch 4 do you have? And it was a couple of 100 bottles there.
Yeah,
It was
we've
like
got batch
115
5
bottles.
locally in
Yeah.
the Total Wines.
Yeah. Hmm. But like California, there may not be a whole lot of batch 4 left. Washington, not a whole lot of it left up here as well. Oregon is a market that I won't even begin to try to understand with its unique operations. No.
I
Mm.
really am completely blown away by the anamorphic.
Yeah.
I think I don't know if everybody remembers the last time we did an Ardbeg tasting. I was back home visiting family, and my sister sat in on the tasting with me, and I had not realized how little whiskey she had actually experienced. And she got 2 sips in, and she's like, "Mother of God, what have you done to me?" And I'm like, I actually think that this is one that I could have her taste and she would not be horrified by, along with a fair amount of what we had tonight, because I think we had all of the really heavy peated stuff the last time. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna have to get some of these so that I can share with her, just so she can try something that isn't all iodine and Band-Aids.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this has been what an incredible tasting. Thank y'all for having me so much. And like the lineup this evening was really just spectacular. I love it because again, we got to focus in on, the flagship of the distillery. Ardbeg 10-year-old is and will always be the most iconic whiskey that we make. I shouldn't say always because I don't want to paint in absolutes. But for now, for the time being, Ardbeg 10-year-old is the most iconic whiskey that we make at the distillery. And this kind of typifies who we are. But it also, to me, gives us access to an entire universe of different flavor profiles to play with, and familiarize ourselves with. And I feel like we've explored all 5 of the different categories of smoke. We've seen more savory and more herbal and medicinal whiskeys coming in the form of heavy vapors and maybe even Ardbeg's Wee Beastie. Both of the batches of the Trayvon whiskeys as well. Some element of coal. There's a little bit of woodiness to them as well. But really, the woody element, I think, was best on display here in Anamorphic. So that was what Vadim and I were really trying to do, was pick from those 5 different flavor profiles of smoke and try to align one whiskey at least to each of them, if not just painting a pretty vivid picture of our smoky universe at Ardbeg. So I really appreciate y'all. Because without you, there is no me, and without you, there is no this brand. So I'm really looking forward to continuing to hopefully bringing this brand to all of you in person this year. Starting with us down in Florida, I hope I see you down at Whiskey X, and I hope I get to see everybody this year as well.
That sounds fabulous. So we usually have a tradition of doing polls of the group for what everyone's favorite expression is. So I did a wiki poll for the first 3 just because somebody commented out of the first 3, and I thought, well, it'd be fun to kind of see those compared to everything. So the whole group poll is still running for all 6 of them. So a couple of people still haven't answered that. So I don't.
Can I ask a question while you wait for that?
Yeah.
So and you mentioned the Cory bacon. I mean, so where would that fit in this tasting? Because being the impatient guy that I am, I'm already checking out where I can buy that anamorphic, and the Cory bacon keeps showing up as well.
I would have put it second, right?
Yeah, I would put it second as well. I think I would have put it right before Heavy Vapors. Yeah, that makes the most sense. Like tasting wise, it would have gone second. In our core range, so our core range is Ardbeg 10-year-old, Ardbeg Anno, Wee Beastie, Ugadal, Cory Vrecken are the 5 whiskeys in the core range for Ardbeg. you could make the argument that because we do one of them every year, Trayvon is technically a core range whiskey, even though I don't really like to call it that because it's a one-off release every year. But you could make the argument. And same thing for the 25. We do a batch of the 25 every year. So technically it's part of the core range, but they're just older whiskeys than anything else that we make, right? But the one-off releases like Anamorphic, we won't make again. Heavy Vapors, we probably won't make something like that again. Hardcore, Bizarrebecue. Maybe we'll do Bizarrebecue again. Actually, we may do that again. I've heard a couple of rumors. But then any of the other Ardbeg Day, other Ardbeg Day releases, Ardbeg, Firm Mutation, all of those are one-off releases that we've done. And those whiskeys are generally exploring one element of the whiskey creation process, and then we put that idea to bed, right? Like if you look at Firm Mutation, what does a really long fermentation time at Ardbeg look like? In fact, the longest fermentation time in recorded Scotch whiskey history, a little over 170 something hours, right? Longest fermentation time. Ardbeg Black. What is Ardbeg matured in Pinot Noir cask coming from New Zealand, which is arguably the crown jewel of Pinot Noir in the world? What does that look like? Hardcore. What does it look like to high roast chocolate malt, drum, Ardbeg and rum casks? So it's just we do a lot of these experiments, but Corey Vrecken and Ugadal and the 10-year Anno and Wee Beastie, those are the whiskeys that we plant our flag in every day, that we stand beside and say, like, these are Ardbeg at its truest, day in and day out.
Thank you. Thank you.
So much fun. I have just for you a question on what you think might have been the favorite of the first three, the 10, the Heavy Vapors, or the Wee Beastie.
I think that the favorite of the first three, I think, was probably Heavy Vapors. It seemed like Wee Beastie is, as it should be, a little bit polarizing. I think the sweetness of Wee Beastie jumped out a little bit. And then I think it was probably Heavy Vapors.
And oddly enough, Heavy Vapors was third.
Whoa, really? I love it.
10-year was first.
Love it, I love it.
I was going to guess
was
the 10.
first.
Yep.
10-year was
That's
first
great.
with 7, Wee Beastie was 6, and Heavy Vapors with 2. I can't vote, so I didn't get to
Okay.
throw my Heavy Vapors choice in there.
Hey, that's great news. That is great news.
I thought you'd like that one.
News.
That was your best one that you liked. And
I love that. Yeah.
And then what do you think was the favorite of the evening out of all 6?
I think it's probably Anamorphic.
Angie would be correct.
Yep. I was gonna
correct.
guess
I love it. Yeah.
It by
Yeah,
a long shot, that had 8 votes out of 15.
Great.
Followed
Great.
by Trayvon 5, and
Five,
Wee Beastie, Heavy Vapors, and Trayvon 4 all got 1 vote.
I love it. Okay.
Interesting
Fantastic.
how the votes changed on the first 3 once you added the last 3.
I was going to say,
Yeah,
you
once we
won and
left.
it didn't get any votes overall. That's weird.
Yeah, really fast.
Exactly. That is amazing. This is such a great group of tasters as well. That I'm not surprised by 10 being the runaway out of the first three. And then based on our conversation and hearing the tasting notes around Anamorphic, it was. Yeah, that I'm not surprised that was so incredibly highly regarded.
Yeah. Well, I definitely want to thank you so much for joining us tonight, Cameron. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Of course.
If anybody has other questions or they want to get back to answer a question that I didn't manage to read off to you, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I will hit stop on the recording and we can all just chat.
Yep. Stop recording. Where are you again in Seattle, Cam?
Yeah, I'm in West